My grandmother found the college fund letter my 9-year-old had hidden in his room, $28,000 saved by his great uncle, a man who loved that boy more than anyone, and she ripped it up in front of him. Not discreetly, not with any hesitation. She tore it into pieces, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "This money belongs to the family, not some kid." He didn't cry. He didn't argue. He quietly took a photo of every piece with his tablet before throwing them away. 5 years later, when she needed $25,000 for medical bills and came to us with her hands out, I smiled. I showed her the photo. And I said, "My son wants to know if?" She collapsed in her chair. Some people who have heard this story say I went too far, that I held a grudge. That family is family, and you don't do what I did to someone who is old and sick and scared. I've heard all of it. But not one person, not one, has ever told me I was wrong about what she did to that little boy. So before you decide what kind of woman I am, let me tell you exactly how we got here. To understand that afternoon in my grandmother Rosalie Ferrera's living room, you have to understand what this family is and what it has always valued. Rosalie Ferrera, my mother's mother, connected to me by blood and by decades of very complicated history, is not a cruel woman in the way people usually mean when they use that word. She doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't throw things. She does something quieter and more precise than that. She decides what people are worth, assigns them a number, and then treats them accordingly for the rest of their lives. I have watched her do it to cousins, to neighbors, to my own mother. And from the time my son Mateo was born, she did it to him. Mateo's father, my ex-husband, Dominic Osei, left when Mateo was 3. That's its own story, and not one I'll tell here. What matters for this story is that after Dominic left, Mateo and I moved into a small rental in Elgin, Illinois, and I went back to work full-time in commercial property management. Rosalie decided, based on approximately nothing, that Mateo was going to be a problem. She used that word when she thought I wasn't listening. She said it to my mother, her daughter Claudette, more than once. "That boy is going to be a problem. Nora can't manage him alone. He needs a man." Mateo was 4 years old. He liked dinosaurs and drawing and asking questions about clouds. My great-uncle Henrique Ferreira, Rosalie's brother-in-law, connected to her by her late husband's family and not by blood, was the one person in that family who saw Mateo clearly. Henrique was 73 when Mateo was born, retired from 30 years of civil engineering, and living quietly in a two-bedroom house in Rockford. He drove down to visit us 4 or 5 times a year. He brought Mateo books. Not picture books, real books with chapters about science and history and animals, books a 4-year-old had no business reading and somehow absorbed like a sponge. Henrique would sit at our kitchen table for hours and just talk to my son like he was a person. Not a project, not a problem. A person. When Mateo turned 6, Henrique pulled me aside at a birthday dinner and told me he had opened a custodial account in Mateo's name. He said, "I want him to have options." I had a grandfather who gave me options, and it changed everything for me. He didn't make a production of it. He didn't announce it at the table or make a speech. He just told me, handed me the account information, and said the deposits would come quarterly. I cried in the car on the way home. I want to be honest about that. By the time Mateo was 9, that account held $28,000. Henrique had been consistent. Every quarter, without fail, a deposit landed. Mateo knew about it, I had told him, because I believe children should understand that money is real and that someone had loved him enough to save it. I told him it was for college. He told me he was going to use it to study marine biology. He was 9. I told him that sounded like a perfect plan. Mateo kept the most recent account statement in his room because he'd asked to see it and I'd printed it for him. He kept it in a folder between 2 dinosaur books on his bottom shelf, which is exactly where a 9-year-old thinks to hide something important. I had no idea Rosalie had been in his room. I still don't know when she went in there or what she was looking for. What I know is what Mateo told me that evening, very calmly, the way he tells me everything, sitting at the kitchen table with his hands folded, like a little judge. "Grandma Rosalie found the paper about my money," he said. "She ripped it up. She said it belongs to the family." I sat down across from him. I kept my voice completely level because he was keeping his completely level, and I was not going to be the one to fall apart first. "Did she say anything else?" "She said Uncle Henrique shouldn't have done that without asking the family." He paused. "I took pictures of all the pieces before I threw them away. I used my tablet. Is that okay?" I looked at my 9-year-old son, who had just watched his great-grandmother destroy something given to him with love, and who had responded not with tears but with documentation, and I felt something move through me that I still don't have a precise word for. Pride, yes, and something colder underneath it. "That's more than okay," I said. "That was exactly right." I called Henrique that night. He was quiet for a long time after I told him what happened. Then he said, "The account is a legal custodial account. Your name is on it as trustee. She can't touch it." Mateo's money is safe. I told him I knew. He said, I'm sorry she frightened him. I told him Mateo hadn't seemed frightened. Henrique was quiet again. No, he said finally. I don't suppose he was. Rosalie never mentioned the incident to me, not once. She behaved at every subsequent family gathering as though it had never happened. My mother, Claudette, caught as always between the need to keep peace with her own mother and the need to defend her daughter, pulled me aside at a cousin's graduation party about 2 months later and said, very quietly, Mama feels terrible about the misunderstanding with the letter. I looked at my mother for a moment. It wasn't a misunderstanding, I said. Then I went back to the buffet table, and we never discussed it again. I kept Mateo's tablet photos in two places, backed up to a cloud account I managed, and copied to a flash drive I kept in my desk at work. I did not tell anyone I had done this. There was nothing dramatic about it. I just kept them, the way you keep something you might need later. Here is what Rosalie did not know about me during all of this. Here is what none of them knew. For the previous 4 years, I had been building something on the side of my property management work, a small residential real estate consulting practice, structured as an LLC that advised first time landlords on tenant screening, lease compliance, and rent pricing strategy in Cook County and the surrounding areas. I had 7 regular clients by the time Mateo turned 9, and I had just signed a contract with a property management firm in Naperville that would add 14 more. The revenue was not extraordinary, but it was consistent and growing. And more importantly, I had spent 3 of those 4 years quietly acquiring something that had nothing to do with income. In March of 2021, I closed on a two-flat in Elgin, a 2-unit residential property, using proceeds I had accumulated quietly over time and a small portfolio loan arranged through my financial advisor, a woman named Diane Cho at a regional wealth management firm in Schaumburg. Diane had been managing a modest investment account I'd started 4 years earlier, and she was the first person outside my immediate professional circle who knew the full picture of what I was building. She had a signature way of delivering good news. She would set her pen down very deliberately, as if the table might break under its weight, and then allow herself the smallest possible smile. She did that when the Elgin property closed. I remember it exactly. The two-flat appraised at $312,000 at closing. I rented both units immediately. Within 18 months, I had refinanced and pulled out equity to fund a second acquisition, a single-family home in a neighboring suburb, purchased as a rental. My name was on both deeds. The LLC owned the consulting practice. My family knew I worked in property management. They assumed I meant I worked for someone else. My mother knew I owned my own rental home because she had asked once if I was still renting, and I had said no, I'd bought a place. She had nodded and moved on. She had not asked any follow-up questions. She asked more questions about Rosalie's blood pressure medication than she ever asked about my finances, which told me everything I needed to know about what she expected from me versus what she expected from the family's real estate investments, the ones her brother-in-law and his wife managed together, the ones that got discussed at every Thanksgiving like they were a shared project everyone contributed to equally. When in fact the capital had come from one place and the credit had been distributed to everyone. I had not told Rosalie. I had not told my Aunt Fernanda, who managed the family's common expenses and who had appointed herself the financial conscience of every adult in the extended family. I had not told my cousin Brielle, Fernanda's daughter, who had a habit of repeating anything she learned about anyone's finances at the exact most inconvenient possible moment. I had kept it quiet deliberately, strategically, and with the specific knowledge that information in this family was not kept, it was deployed. In the spring of the year Mateo turned 11, I sat down with an attorney named Gordon Lau, a family law and estate planning specialist whose office was in downtown Chicago. My financial situation had grown complicated enough to warrant professional guidance, and Diane Cho had referred me to him as someone who specialized in protecting assets in situations involving complex family dynamics, a phrase I now understand to be professional code for families like mine. Gordon was methodical and unhurried. He wore the same type of charcoal blazer at every meeting. He had a way of asking questions that made you feel like you were being very gently dismantled and reassembled into something more legally coherent. I liked him immediately. Our first consultation, in late April, covered 3 things: the trust structure for Mateo's future inheritance and any assets I intended to leave him, the proper legal separation of my LLC from my personal finances, and the documentation of what I had properties, accounts, the consulting practice, in a form that would hold up to scrutiny if anyone ever contested it. I told Gordon about Rosalie and the letter. He looked at me steadily. Do you have documentation of the account's existence at that time? I told him about Mateo's tablet photos. He nodded once, the way lawyers nod when they file something away in a category they plan to return to. Keep those, he said. That was all. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. I drove home through evening traffic feeling something I can only describe as structural, like I had just reinforced the load-bearing walls of something I was still building. Mateo was at a sleepover at his friend Tobias's house. The apartment was quiet. I made tea, sat at the kitchen table, and went through the notes Gordon's office had emailed me, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was not just reacting to this family. I was ahead of them. By a distance they could not begin to estimate. If you have ever been counted out by someone who should have known you better, you know exactly what that feeling is. It doesn't feel like victory, not yet. It feels like standing very still in a room while other people walk past you without seeing you, and knowing, not hoping, knowing, that the moment they need to see you, you will be exactly where you are. After that first meeting, Gordon recommended I contact his colleague at the same firm, an estate attorney named Helena Baird, about formalizing Henrique's custodial account arrangement within a broader trust structure for Mateo's benefit. Henrique was 82 by this point, still sharp, still driving himself to the grocery store, but at an age where planning mattered. Helena Baird had a small framed print in her office, a sailboat in flat water, totally calm, and I remember thinking it was the most accurate possible metaphor for how she moved through a consultation. Nothing urgent, everything intentional. Helena walked me through the process of establishing a formal education trust, separate from the existing custodial account, but structured to receive future contributions, including Henrique's ongoing deposits. All assets within the trust would be managed by a trustee. I was named trustee. Mateo, as the beneficiary, would gain access to the funds under conditions specified in the trust documents, educational expenses, essentially, administered through me until he was 25. Helena said, very matter of factly, this creates a layer of legal clarity that protects the funds regardless of any family dispute about their origin or intended use. I told her that was precisely what I needed. She made a small note on her legal pad. It generally is, she said. Mateo had no knowledge of these meetings. He was 11, then 12. He was building model rockets and reading everything he could find about deep-sea creatures, and going through a phase of cooking elaborate breakfasts on Saturday mornings that left the kitchen in a state I can only describe as enthusiastic. He was a happy kid, a genuinely happy kid, in the way that some children manage to be despite everything that has happened to them, and I was fiercely, quietly determined that nothing and no one was going to touch what had been set aside for his future. Rosalie came to our apartment twice during this period. Once for Mateo's 12th birthday, when she brought a card and sat in our living room for 45 minutes talking almost exclusively about her own health. Once for a Sunday lunch I hosted when my mother was in town visiting. At both visits, Rosalie was cordial to Mateo in the way you are cordial to a child you have assessed and found wanting, polite on the surface, absent underneath. She asked him how school was. He told her it was fine. She patted his hand. He smiled with his mouth. I watched all of it from across the room and said nothing. The second visit, the Sunday lunch, produced the closest thing to a close call I experienced during those years. Fernanda was also there, and Fernanda had recently become intensely interested in investment properties, sparked by a podcast she had been listening to and a conversation she'd had with someone at her gym. She cornered me in my own kitchen while I was plating food and began asking me, with great enthusiasm, whether I had ever considered getting into real estate investment. You work in property management, she said, like this was an insight. You must have the inside track on deals. She set her glass on my counter and leaned forward. Have you ever actually thought about buying something? I handed her a bowl of rice. I've thought about it, I said. You should look into it seriously, Fernanda said. There are really good opportunities right now. Brielle's friend bought a condo and she's already made $60,000 in equity. She picked up the rice bowl, then put it back down. Of course, you need capital to start. Do you have any savings built up or are you still, she paused, gesturing vaguely at my apartment in a way that was meant to convey modest circumstances, working on that? I looked at her for just a moment. I'm working on it, I said pleasantly. Then I asked her to carry the bread to the table. She went. She had no idea. Behind her, in the folder on my desk in the next room, were the deeds to two properties. Between them, they had accumulated approximately $104,000 in equity since I'd bought them. I did not think about that number with satisfaction, exactly. I thought about it the way you think about something that is already yours, without drama, just acknowledgement. By the time Mateo turned 13, Henrique's health had begun to decline. Not dramatically, not suddenly, more like a very gradual quieting. He had a small cardiac event in November that year, recovered well, but moved into an assisted living facility outside Rockford in February. Mateo and I visited him there every few weeks. Henrique loved those visits. He and Mateo would play chess and argue about science, and Henrique would tell Mateo stories about building bridges in the 1970s that Mateo listened to with an intensity I found genuinely moving. On one of those visits, Henrique asked to speak with me privately. Mateo went to the common room to watch something on his phone, and Henrique told me he had updated his estate planning documents to include a direct bequest to Mateo's education trust, in addition to the ongoing custodial contributions. He told me Helena Baird had prepared the documents. He told me the amount would be substantial enough to matter. He told me, and this is the part I have never forgotten, I want him to know that somebody in this family saw what he is. I wanted it in writing. I drove home that afternoon in silence for most of the trip. Mateo fell asleep in the passenger seat around Belvedere, which he never does. He's the kind of kid who talks the whole way home from anywhere. I drove and watched the flat November landscape go past and thought about an old man in a facility outside Rockford who had decided, years ago, that my son was worth something and who had made sure that decision would survive him. Gordon Lau's office emailed me 6 weeks later with a summary of the trust documents as updated. I went through them at my desk on a Tuesday evening. Everything was in order. Everything was protected. The timing couldn't have been more complete or more fragile. Because by then, I had begun to understand that something was shifting in Rosalie's finances. My mother had mentioned, in passing, that Rosalie had some unexpected medical expenses. Fernanda had mentioned, less in passing, that things were tighter than expected at the family level. Nobody said numbers. Nobody ever said numbers in that family, not to me. But I know how to read a room, and I know what it sounds like when a family begins circling toward a source of water. I had been patient for 5 years. I had been strategic. I had been building something real and solid and documented and protected, while the woman who had torn up a letter in front of my 9-year-old son had gone on assuming she knew exactly what I was worth. She was about to find out she had been working from very old information. The call came on a Wednesday evening in late October of 2023. My mother's voice had that particular texture it gets when she is about to deliver news she has been sitting on for too long, slightly too measured, slightly too careful, like she has rehearsed the sentence more than once. Mama needs help, she said. Medical bills, it's serious, Nora. I was standing in my kitchen, still in my work clothes, Mateo's backpack dropped by the front door because he was 14 now and still couldn't manage to hang it on the hook I had installed specifically for that purpose. I held the phone against my ear and looked at the hook. How much? I asked. My mother paused. $25,000. The insurance only covered part of the procedure. There's a gap. What kind of procedure? Her hip. She had a fall back in August. She didn't want to worry anyone. Another pause. The assisted care facility has been sending notices. She's behind on 3 months. I pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down, not from shock, more from the need to be very deliberate about what happened next in my body because my mind had already moved several steps ahead. Who else knows? Fernanda, your cousin Brielle. They've both contributed what they can. My mother's voice tightened almost imperceptibly. We were hoping, the family thought, given that Henrique has been so generous with Mateo over the years, and since you work in real estate now, you might have something put aside. There it was. The architecture of the ask, fully assembled. Henrique's generosity reframed as family generosity, which therefore created a family obligation. My work in real estate presented as though it were a shared resource, a common account everyone was entitled to draw from. I recognized the logic because I had watched this family apply it to every financial question for as long as I could remember. Anything anyone had was understood to belong, at some level, to the collective, unless you were the one asking. I'll come to Sunday dinner, I said. We can talk about it then. My mother exhaled. That's wonderful. I know Mama will be so relieved. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after we hung up. Mateo came through eventually, opened the refrigerator, stared into it with the focused vacancy that is apparently standard for 14-year-old boys, and then turned around. You okay? Fine, I said. How was school? Fine. He looked at me for a moment. Is it Grandma Rosalie again? He had always been perceptive, my son. Even as a small boy, he noticed things adults assumed children missed. I nodded. Sunday dinner. He went back to the refrigerator. Okay. He pulled out leftover pasta. Want some? Yeah, I said. I'll heat it up. We ate at the kitchen table and talked about his biology project, and I listened to him describe the feeding habits of the mimic octopus with the kind of attention you give something that matters to you, and I kept the other conversation in a separate, very quiet part of my mind where I had been keeping things for 5 years. That night, after Mateo was in his room, I called Gordon Lau. It was after 9, and I got his voicemail, and I left a message that said I needed 15 minutes with him before Friday. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the cloud account where I had kept, for 5 years, the folder containing the photos of a torn letter. 31 images. Every piece of that account statement, photographed on a 9-year-old's tablet, reassembled in sequence like a puzzle someone had been patient enough to solve. I looked at them for a long time. Then I went to my bedroom, laid out my clothes for Sunday, and went to sleep. Gordon called me back the following morning before 8, which is the kind of thing that happens when you have been a reliable client for 2 years and you leave messages that are specific rather than emotional. I told him the situation. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "What are you planning to do?" "I'm going to Sunday dinner," I said, "and I'm going to answer the question they're asking." A pause. "All of it?" "All of it." He was quiet for a moment in the way that Gordon gets quiet when he is deciding whether something is legally advisable versus simply human. The account documentation is clean, the trust is established. The photos are time-stamped and stored in 2 locations. Another pause. "Nora, are you sure about the timing?" She tore up a letter in front of my 9-year-old, I said. "He's 14 now. I think the timing is fine." Gordon said he'd have his office email me a summary document of the trust structure and the current valuations on both properties. He said it in the tone of a man who has made peace with the fact that some of his clients are going to do things that are legally sound and personally satisfying, and that his job is to make sure the legal soundness part is airtight. I thanked him. He told me to let him know how it went. "I am still with you if you are still with me, because what I did next is the reason I am telling you this story." I forwarded Gordon's document to my own email. Then I opened a second folder on my laptop, one I had not opened in a long time, that contained a single PDF, the most recent appraisal of the Elgin 2 flat, updated 6 months prior. The property had appreciated significantly since I bought it. The combined equity across both properties as of that spring was $218,000. Not a fortune, but not nothing. And absolutely, completely mine. I printed both documents. I folded them and put them in my work bag. Then I texted my mother that I would be there Sunday at 1 o'clock and asked if I should bring anything. She texted back, "Just yourself, sweetheart." I drove to Rosalie's house on Sunday afternoon, a 2-story colonial in a quiet part of Oak Park that she had lived in since before my mother was grown, connected to me through my mother's blood, and therefore to everything I carried in that blood. Fernanda's car was already in the driveway. My mother's sedan was parked at the curb. I sat in my car for 90 seconds, my hands relaxed in my lap, looking at the house. Then I picked up my bag and went inside. The living room had the particular arrangement it always had when the family was gathering for something serious dressed up as something normal. Good dishes on the dining table, the good tablecloth, the lamp by the window turned on even though it was 1:30 in the afternoon, and the light was adequate. Rosalie was in her chair by the window. She looked smaller than the last time I had seen her, which had been at Easter, not dramatically smaller, but in the way of a person whose body has begun the slow work of contracting toward its own center. The hip surgery had changed her posture. She held herself more carefully now. Her silver hair was done, though. She had made an effort. She looked up when I came in. "Nora." Her voice was warm in the way it was always warm with me when she wanted something. "Come sit." Fernanda was at the dining table, arranging something. She glanced up and gave me the particular smile she deploys when she is both glad to see you and slightly calculating about what your presence means. My mother came out of the kitchen with a dish towel and hugged me. Her hug was real, not performative. My mother is complicated, but her affection for me has never been the complicated part. Brielle was there too, sitting on the small sofa near the bookcase, scrolling her phone. She was 29, Fernanda's daughter, and the only other person in that room who had any idea that I had been quietly building something. She didn't know the extent of it, but she had been the one asking me kitchen questions about investment properties the previous year, and she was smart enough to have registered that my answer had been careful rather than ignorant. We sat down to lunch. The conversation for the first half hour was exactly the conversation this family always has when it is performing normalcy before a difficult subject. Health updates, weather, someone's kid doing something at school. Rosalie talked about her physical therapy. Fernanda talked about a renovation she was considering. My mother kept getting up to bring things from the kitchen. I ate and listened and said appropriate things at appropriate intervals, and underneath it all I was very calm. The way you are calm when you have already made a decision and the only thing remaining is the execution. It was Fernanda who moved us there. She always did. She had an instinct for the practical that cut through social padding when social padding was no longer useful. She set her fork down with the deliberateness of a woman calling a meeting to order. We should probably talk about the situation. Rosalie looked at her lap. My mother, coming back from the kitchen, stopped in the doorway. Of course, I said. Fernanda folded her hands on the table. You know about the bills, your mother explained? $25,000, I said. The insurance gap, yes. We've all contributed what we can. Fernanda's gaze was even, not unkind. She genuinely believed what she was about to say. As a family, we thought, given everything, given that Henrique has been so generous with Mateo's fund over the years, that it would be right for you to help cover a larger portion. It would only be fair. There was the word, fair. I had been waiting for it. Rosalie lifted her eyes from her lap. She looked at me with an expression I had seen before, the one that contains a request and a demand in the same breath, the one she had perfected over decades of being the matriarch of a family that had learned to give her what she asked for. My grandson's fund, she said quietly, came from this family. From Henrique. He is family. That money, it has always been family money. Across the table, Brielle had stopped looking at her phone. She was watching me with the stillness of someone who has picked up a frequency nobody else can hear yet. I reached into my bag. I took out the folded documents. I set them on the table beside my plate, not yet unfolded. Before we talk about what's fair, I said, I want to show you something. I opened my phone. I navigated to the cloud folder I had accessed the night before. I turned the screen to face Rosalie. 31 photos. Every piece of a torn account statement, arranged in order on a 9-year-old's tablet screen. The account number, the balance, the name of the custodian, the name of the beneficiary, all of it documented, time-stamped, preserved. Rosalie looked at the screen. The expression on her face shifted in a way I can only describe as internal, something moved behind her eyes that did not surface immediately. Her hand came up to the arm of her chair and gripped it. My son wants to know, I said, if the family would like to contribute to his college fund, since it's family money. Nobody spoke. 4 full seconds of silence so complete that I could hear the refrigerator running in the kitchen. Rosalie's hand tightened on the arm of the chair. Nora, her voice was thin, stretched. I was trying to protect the families. He was 9, I said. He didn't cry. He photographed every piece before he threw them away. He was 9 years old and he understood, better than anyone in this room, that what you did was worth documenting. Fernanda's lips had parted slightly. She was looking between me and Rosalie with an expression that was recalibrating in real time, the confident family mediator suddenly realizing she had walked into a room she had not mapped. My mother, still standing in the doorway, had put both hands around the dish towel she was holding and was not letting go. That account, I continued, still very level, still not raising my voice, was a legal custodial account in my name as trustee. It was never family money. It was never yours to decide about. The letter you destroyed was the most recent statement. The account still exists. It has grown considerably since Mateo was 9, because Henrique continued contributing until his death, and because I have managed it with exactly the same care I have applied to everything else I have built over the last 6 years. I unfolded the first document. I turned it so Fernanda could read it from across the table, because Fernanda was going to be the one who needed to understand it, not Rosalie. Rosalie was already somewhere else. I could see it in the way she had settled back into the chair, as though she were slowly pressing herself into the upholstery. This is a summary of a trust established in 2022 for Mateo's benefit. It was drafted by an estate attorney named Helena Baird and reviewed by my attorney, Gordon Lau. Mateo is the sole beneficiary. I am the trustee. No one else has any legal claim on these funds, not this family, not anyone. Fernanda looked at the document. She looked at it the way people look at things they were not prepared to understand, slowly, then again from the top. I don't, she started. There's more, I said. I unfolded the second document. Fernanda looked up at me before looking at it. Something in her expression had shifted. The comfortable authority she carried in this family was still there, but it was standing in a different position now, more defensive, less assumed. This is the current appraisal summary for my investment properties. I own 2 residential units in Elgin and 1 single-family rental in the neighboring suburb. As of the most recent appraisal, the combined equity is $218,000. Both properties are held in my name. I have a financial advisor, Diane Cho, who manages an associated investment account. None of this is family money either. Brielle set her phone face down on the sofa cushion beside her. She was leaning forward very slightly, elbows on her knees, watching me with an expression I had never seen on her before. Not shock, something closer to recognition, like a person hearing a language they studied once and thought they had forgotten. Fernanda stood up. Not abruptly, she rose from her chair the way someone rises when they need to create distance and movement because sitting still is no longer possible. She walked to the window and stood there with her back partially to the room. Nora, why are you showing us this now? Because you asked me to contribute to a bill by telling me that Henrique's generosity was family generosity, which created a family obligation. My voice was the same it had been since I sat down. I am showing you the full picture so that when we talk about fairness, we are working with accurate information. That's not, Fernanda turned back. Her jaw was set, but something around her eyes had gone uncertain. That's not what any of us meant. We were not questioning Mateo's money. We were asking for your help. I know what you were asking for, I said. I have the photos to show me exactly what this family decided Mateo's money was worth 5 years ago. 31 of them. Rosalie made a sound, not a word, something smaller, compressed. She had been so still in her chair that I think everyone in the room had momentarily forgotten she was the center of it. She looked up at me, and for the first time in the years I had known her, Rosalie Ferreira looked genuinely old. Not diminished, old in the true sense, in the sense of having used up something she could not get back. Her hand was still on the arm of the chair. I was wrong, she said. The words landed in the room with a weight that surprised even me. Not because I hadn't expected her to eventually arrive there, but because the directness of it was so unlike her. No qualifier, no but, just two words delivered to the tablecloth. Rosalie. My mother's voice came from the doorway. It was broken in a specific place, the way a voice breaks when it is trying to hold several things at once and cannot manage all of them. I was wrong about the boy. Rosalie's voice was barely above speaking level. She looked at the phone screen, still facing her, still showing the 31 photos. He didn't deserve that. I told myself it was about the family, but I was angry. Henrique always did things without asking. I was always the one who, she stopped. Her hand made a small, helpless movement. It doesn't matter now why, it was wrong. I knew it when I was doing it. The room held that. I let it hold it for a long moment, not to be cruel. Because it was real, and real things deserve the space they take up. Then I said, I know you did. Fernanda had come back from the window. She was standing at the edge of the table, not sitting, not quite leaving. Her voice came out flattened. So, what does this mean? For the bills? I looked at her. It means I am not going to contribute to Rosalie's medical bills on the basis that Mateo's fund is family money. That argument is over. I held her gaze. If this family wants to ask me, as a granddaughter, to consider helping someone who is elderly and sick and facing bills she can't cover, that is a different conversation, and I would have a different answer. Fernanda blinked. Once then again. Something in her posture shifted, the rigidity softened in a way that was not defeat exactly, but was close to it. She sat back down. My mother came fully into the room for the first time. She sat at the table across from me and put her hands flat on the tablecloth and looked at them. I should have said something, she said. When it happened, with the letter, I should have said something to Mama. Yes, I said. She looked up at me, her eyes were bright. I'm sorry, Nora. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. This was the moment, the one that had nothing to do with documents or equity or trust structures. This was just my mother, who is complicated and sometimes weak, and who has loved me her entire life, sitting across from me and telling me she had let me down. I kept my hand on hers. I know, I said. Brielle spoke from the sofa for the first time. Her voice was quieter than usual, stripped of the social performance she typically layers over everything. The photos. She was looking at my phone, still on the table. He really took them himself, before he threw the pieces away, I said. He was 9. He said he wanted to remember what happened. Brielle was quiet for a moment, then she said, he sounds like someone worth knowing. He is, I said. Rosalie had not spoken again. She was looking at the window now, the one that looked out over the front yard, the one she had probably looked out of 1,000 times over the decades she had lived in this house. Her hand was no longer gripping the chair arm. It was resting open in her lap, palm up, the way hands rest when they have stopped holding something. I picked up my phone. I folded the documents. I put them back in my bag. I'll cover $5,000 toward the facility's overdue balance, I said. Not as family obligation, as a decision I'm making. I looked at Rosalie. But I want you to tell Mateo directly what you told me, that you were wrong, not through my mother, not in a card, to him, in person. Rosalie turned from the window. She met my eyes. For 3 long seconds she was silent. Then she nodded once slowly, with the weighted dignity of someone who has spent a long time being powerful and is now doing something that requires a different kind of strength. All right, she said. The following weekend, Rosalie came to our apartment. I had told Mateo she was coming and why. He'd received the information with the equanimity that characterized most of what he did, a brief pause, a nod, and then a question about whether he needed to be doing something specific or whether he should just be there. I told him he just needed to be there. She arrived at 2 in the afternoon. I made coffee. Rosalie sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Mateo had told me 5 years ago about what she had done, and she told him in her careful, deliberate way that she had been wrong, that the money was his, that she had known it at the time and had told herself a different story. Mateo listened with his hands folded on the table. When she finished, he said, "Okay." Then, after a short pause, he said, "Do you want to see my biology project? It's about mimic octopuses." Rosalie looked at him for a moment. Something crossed her face that I do not have a precise name for. Grief, maybe, or the specific species of regret that arrives when you realize you have wasted years of someone's time. "I would very much like to see that," she said. He got his laptop and showed her. In the months following that Sunday, several things resolved themselves in the way things resolve when the weight they have been carrying is finally acknowledged and set down. Fernanda never brought up the properties again. She called me once, about 3 weeks after the dinner, and said stiffly that she had told her financial advisor she needed to reconsider her retirement timeline, which I understood to be her way of saying she was adjusting to a version of me that was different from the one she had been operating with. I told her I hoped the conversation with the advisor was useful. She said it was. We hung up. My mother called more often after that. The calls were different in a quality I noticed but did not comment on, more direct, less mediating, less of the managed distance she had always put between her honest self and the roles she performed for the family. We talked about real things. We disagreed sometimes. It was better. Rosalie paid down the remaining medical bill balance through a payment plan she arranged with the facility. I was not part of that. It was her to manage, and she managed it. She is still in the Oak Park house. She has a home health aide now, 3 days a week. I visit occasionally. The visits are not warm exactly, but they are honest, which is more than they ever were before. Mateo's education trust, as of this past spring, holds enough to cover 4 years at any university he chooses, with room for graduate work if he wants it. Henrique died 14 months ago, quietly, in his room in Rockford, with a copy of a deep sea biology book Mateo had recommended on his nightstand. I was there. Mateo was there too, because he had asked to be, and I had said yes. He held Henrique's hand in the last hour. He was 14 years old and he knew exactly what to do. The two rental properties are both fully leased. Diane Cho and I meet quarterly. Gordon Lau is still my attorney. I am still in property management. My own consulting practice now occupies more of my time than the managing job does, which is the kind of shift you work toward for years without quite believing it will arrive. And then it does, and you simply get up in the morning and do the new thing. I don't spend much time thinking about that Sunday at Rosalie's house. What I think about more is the Tuesday night I drove home from Henrique's facility in November, Mateo asleep in the passenger seat, the flat landscape going past, and the feeling of having held something steady for long enough that it had become structure rather than effort. That is the thing nobody in my family understood about me, and maybe the thing I cannot fully explain even now. I was never waiting to win. I was building something that didn't need to win because it was already real. Mateo asked me last week if Grandma Rosalie was coming to his science fair. I said I didn't think so, but that I would ask her. He said okay and went back to his notes on cephalopod intelligence, and that was the whole conversation. He is 15 now. He is, in every way I can measure, happy. So, I showed an 81-year-old woman 31 photographs of something she destroyed 5 years ago. I declined to rescue her using money she had already decided belonged to her. I told the whole truth in a room full of people who had been working from a much shorter version of it. Did I go too far? Or not far enough? Tell me in the comments.